Welcome everybody tonight and to our lecture series. We're very pleased to have you all here tonight. Tonight we will be talking about the Thompson Boat Company. We're very pleased to have Bruce Thompson here over from Ithaca, grandson and son of the Thompson family that did all the stuff with the Thompson Boat Company. So he's here to talk about his legacy and the family's legacy. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thank you, Andrew. So, thanks for inviting me, and appreciate the time to talk with you all. And if you have any questions as we go along, I'm sure that's okay, and obviously at the end that's great too. I am of the Thompson family. However, I did not work in the boat factory at all. My father was the second generation, and he took over the Cortland factory, as you'll see, in 1946. My grandfather was of the first generation, and his elder brothers are the ones that actually did the first boats, as you'll see. I'm not going, it is history, and you'll see the general history of the Thompson Boat Company, but I haven't been real detailed. I'm not going to be real detailed about that, and it's more of a history and how our family has used the boats that have been made by Thompson as well. So there's a lot of remembrances of times on the south end of Skaneateles Lake where we have had a cottage since we moved to the area, since my parents moved to the area. So we've got our official hats. I'm going to put it here so a reminder of what we're all about here as we go along. And to begin with, really the Thompson story begins with an immigrant family, and as you can see, it's not a small family. 6 of the siblings, of the 12 siblings, were born in Denmark before they moved to the United States. And they came in through New York City, as so many did. But when they got to the immigration office and were filling out the forms, our last name got transposed with our middle name, and so the family who was known as Christensen in Denmark became known as Thompson in the New World. So it's not Christensen boats, it's Thompson boats. Also, before I go on, I just wanted to thank Katie for helping me out with a lot of the pictures that we dug out, and also for helping me with the presentation. So just pass by her first, of course. So the family first went to Racine, Wisconsin, which had a large Danish community and people that they knew who had moved there. But soon after, when they were there, elder brother Peter started working at the Racine Boat Company that built large motor launches for Lake Michigan. And he started there when he was 12 years old and actually worked for 12 years there. Meanwhile, the family, in about 5 years after getting to Racine, moved up to Peshtigo, Wisconsin. That was in 1899. And my grandfather, who was one of the younger ones, this is my grandfather here, about, I think, 12 years younger than Peter, recalls when they moved up to the Peshtigo area, the whole area had been burnt to the ground in 1871 by the Peshtigo fire, which was at the same time, exact same time as the Chicago fire, but with much greater loss of life in Peshtigo than in Chicago, actually, because of the extensive pine forest up there that burned, and it burned the whole town. And so my grandfather remembered the burnt pines everywhere when they moved up there. As I said, Pete worked at the Racine Boat Company, stayed behind and kept working there. And after 12 years or so, he actually went to Michigan and worked with a fellow by the name of Chris Smith and his brother Henry Smith. And well, only for a year, but Chris Smith went on to create Chris Craft. And so there's a slight connection there between Chris Craft and Thompson. So the brothers started building boats in 1904, and the two brothers that did start building the boats in the family farm, the loft of the family farm barn, were Peter and Chris, the elder brothers. And they built 5 what they called anti-leak canoes in the hayloft of the barn in 1904. And those were made out of basswood and with elm ribs, so basswood planks and elm ribs. And the wood came from the farm, so I don't know if they had a sawmill on the farm or whether they took the logs in and had them milled and then brought them back, but the wood was from the farm. Soon after that, they were joined by the other brothers, and this one is Ed and Richard and Tom and Ted. And so they were successful enough that they created the Thompson Brothers Boat Manufacturing Company a few years later. So here is a picture of the family farm, the barn of the family farm, and my uncle has an X here above the loft where the boat building occurred. As you can see, it's a Wisconsin sand prairie land out there. The farm ended up growing potatoes mostly because that was about the only thing that grew in this land. And so getting into something that didn't require income from farming was good for the family. Here's another picture of the hayloft of the barn where they were building the boats, and mostly in the wintertime in the first couple of years when the farming chores were not active. I love this picture. It's not quite complete. As you can see, this is Ed, and here's Tom and Ted. They were actually fraternal twins. That's my grandfather. And then Richard is here, and Peter is here, and then a couple of neighbor farm boys, Otto Hansen and Augie Johnson. Chris is not here because he ended up being the manager and worked in sales in the office from the get-go. And so he was not in this picture of all the workers working on the boats. So in 1907, this was the whole crew probably. As you can see, Ed is standing off here on his own, and that's kind of what he liked to do, is be on his own. He was not chummy with his other brothers, but he ended up being the one that did a lot of the innovation and for new boats, and a lot of the design work for the new boats. And as a note related to the year that we were just coming out of, Richard is the brother that died in the 1918 pandemic. So he was 28 years old when he succumbed to the pandemic. Before that, he was an active member of the Thompson Brothers. Here's a picture of my grandfather, about 20 years old, 1909, with the basswood canoe that came out of the warehouse. Looks like he just finished caning the seats for the canoe here. He's about to maybe flip it over and put that into place. So things went really well out of the hayloft of the barn right away. So that was 1904, and by 1912, before I go on, here's a picture of the rowboats that they started producing. So for example, this was from 1910. Similar construction to the canoes, but in a rowboat style. They even had one with a rudder on the back here for steering with ropes that came forward. And so by 1911, they were shipping 500 items out of their hayloft, out of their construction in their barn. And things were getting pretty tight. It's awesome to me that a crew of about that number of people that I showed were producing 500 boats a year. They were really putting them out. Yeah. So they were running out of space, and they still had a market that they could see coming, so they moved to the town of Peshtigo, which was down on the Peshtigo River that runs into Green Bay, northern Green Bay, Lake Michigan, and was about 10 miles from the farm by 1912. And then, so here's a picture. I don't have a good picture of the manufacturing plant itself, but here's one corner of the factory that they built in Peshtigo. This was a one-off commercial boat. They built a 50-foot long boat. I don't know how they built that in that factory either, together with all the other boats that they were building, but they managed to do it. In 1915, so that was 3 years after they moved to Peshtigo. They didn't do, I don't know if this is maybe the only one of this size that they ever did. I don't know of any others. At least I haven't seen any. Well, Outboard Motors had their birth at about this time when Ole Evinrude got a patent on the outboard motor. And we have one example at our place. I think this one is from 1915. An Evinrude one banger, one cylinder. You can see there's a knuckle buster on top. That's how you started it up, by grabbing hold of that and giving it a fling. And if it came around and busted your knuckles if you didn't watch out. Anyway, Ole did this in Milwaukee, and in that he took the time to travel up to Peshtigo with his invention to try to talk to the Thompson brothers about putting it on one of their boats. And in fact, so the Thompson brothers were intrigued by the idea and could see the future of that, perhaps. And so they ended up building this specially made canoe that they called the speed canoe for a detachable motor. And what they did was take a regular canoe but flatten out the back and put a little keel on the back. And flattening out so that it would support the weight of the motor, and putting a straight transom across the back like they had for the rudder. But the shape of the boat was different to accommodate the outboard motor itself. It looks like, I don't know anything about this, but it looks like there's another speed canoe that they made that actually had an inboard, because here's a propeller sticking out of the bottom of this one. So it must have been some kind of a naphtha engine or something in that one. So, I just threw this in here because it shows how much fun the Thompsons were having in their own boats. So this is on the Peshtigo River. And I know that that's my grandfather. I'm not sure. I think this is Uncle Tom. I'm not sure the other folks here, but I'm sure that might be Hannah, one of the elder sisters. As was common at the time, the sisters were not participating. It was the Thompson Brothers Boat Company, but the one piece of information I have is that Johanna, one of the elder sisters, worked in the office and did a lot of the office management for the company over the years, not only in Peshtigo, but after she moved to Cortland as well. And so there was some participation by the sisters. So another interesting picture I thought was this one showing a trailer boat. I'm not sure what year this is, but it somewhat illustrates the philosophy of the Thompson Boat Company to make a boat that average people could own. That it wasn't real expensive if they could help it, and the average person could get a fishing boat for themselves, or a family boat. And that held all the way through the years of production of wooden boats. So on one of the models, and I'm not sure what year this catalog was, but there's spray rails all over on the boat, so it must have been, I'll talk about them in a minute, but it must have been past 1932 when they started putting spray rails on. But this was called the high-speed fish boat, and I show that because this fellow, by the name of Franklin Cook, in 1929, was busy, as were many, in boat races. And there were outboard boat races as well as inboard boat races. And as you can see, this is an outboard race with a motor that's somewhat similar to the one that I showed you earlier there. He had a great run in the Chicago race, and this is his testimonial that he wrote to the Thompson brothers. Mr. Cook wired the Thompsons as follows: my Thompson high-speed fish boat won first place in Class B in the Milwaukee to Chicago Marathon on Saturday, and fifth place in the entire race, competing with 95 of the fastest boats in the country. My Thompson was the only boat that finished dry. I did not need to bail it the whole trip, and when I got to Chicago, the boat was in better condition than any other boat there. It is as tight as a drum, and even after the most severe pounding the boat ever received, it rode level at times, all times, and did not pound the way all of the other boats did. It cut through 5-foot waves and really rode them instead of smashing up and down all over the place. It attained good planing speed even in the roughest waters. So, great testimonial from boat racers. This, in the late 20s, early 30s, it was a real active time for racing boats, and so to get your Thompson or your boat into there was great advertising for the company.
Could you go back one?
Sure.
We have one here. The boat on the bottom right,
This one.
Thompson V-type,
Yeah.
TVT.
Yep.
There's one of those here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
How much did it cost there? 200 and,
$250.
all right.
I'll show some more pictures of some Thompson TVTs. Yeah. These were all actually TVTs, and the TVT meant Thompson V-type. V meaning that toward the bow there was a deep V shape, but then it gradually flattened out toward the aft end of the boat, and that's why the boat racer was talking about the fact that you could it would cut through the waves nicely because it would spread the waves out and throw them aside before the flat part of the boat got to the wave. So, as I said, the TVT was one of the most successful boats, and was in production. Let's see, I was going to get to that. From 1929 to 1956, they produced a very similar, or boats they called the TVT through that whole time. And that's just a repeat of what I was saying about how it flattened out toward the stern. Here's a TVT from 1955 that we own. It came to us from first of all, it was owned by Ivan Hall, who was one of the workers in the Cortland plant. And as I said, it was 1955. And then my brother got it from him, and it sat in my brother's barn for a whole bunch of years. I don't know how many years. Until about the mid-2000s, when I traded a chest freezer for the boat. And he took the chest freezer, I took the boat. And Katie and I did a little bit of work on it. We kind of scrubbed the bottom, but this is how it came to us after we scrubbed the bottom. There was a little bit of oil in the bottom, but that was about it. So it was in great shape. Before I go any further though, just to emphasize how the boat was built. As you can see, these cedar strips, they're about 1 inch wide cedar strips that were butted up against each other and then screwed to the ribs. The one innovation of the Thompson boats was this compressed seam method of putting the boats together, where the rib would have a slight, or the cedar strip would have a slight nose on it after going through the shaping machine, and then that was run through a machine that would compress that nose down before they put it on the boat. So it was kind of squashing the wood. And then they assembled the boat, and then the first time the boat went in the water, that would expand and permanently expand, and so it would seal those strips against each other, and that was part of their method for creating a boat that didn't leak, was for those compressed seams to expand for the first time when it got in the water. As I mentioned, the spray rail was another innovation from Thompson in 1932, and that added a couple of things. One is it kept the spray from coming into the boat. It would deflect it to the side, but in the course of deflecting it, it would actually raise the boat up a little bit too. That the spray would actually give some upward pressure on the boat and lift the boat further out of the water and make it plane and go even faster because it was a little bit more out of the water. So here's our friend Justin Armstrong, along with me. He's starting to work on the boat for us. And he did the renovation, but that really, for this boat, it only needed a little bit of paint work and varnish work. He re-varnished the whole inside and so forth. He got to the deck and he said, he called me down and he said, you know, I've got this one section of the deck. I wondered if you wanted me to leave it at it as it was, or you want me to redo it. And the reason was that one of the workers' handprints was in underneath the varnish on the deck, and so we decided to leave it that way. So that's cool. We don't know whose hand it was, but it was one of the workers' hands sitting there. And this is the way it looks now, that it's all restored with the new paint and all. We put a modern non-polluting engine on it because we didn't have, we thought it was best for Skinny Atlas like that.
What's the boat weigh, roughly?
Oh gosh, I don't know. We could go back.
Does it say in the
It
specs?
probably goes back to the specs here, we can find out.
Yeah.
200 pounds, 200 to 220 pounds for that.
It's light for a boat that size.
That's a 14-footer, so yeah, 2 to 210. And it got a lot of praise at the 2009 Sky Atlas Boat Show because there was no wood need to be renovated or replaced at all on the whole boat. It was in pristine. The Ivan Hall had used it for fishing for years, but he always put it in the lake, went fishing, pulled it out of the lake, got all the water out of it, and put it in his garage before he took it out the next time. So in 1920, the production of boats in Peshtigo, Wisconsin went so well that, and they were starting to sell on the East Coast. They had a big dealer in Rochester as well as on Long Island. And so they were thinking, well, we should maybe, instead of the cost of shipping everything out there, we should start building boats out near the East Coast and reduce our shipping costs. And so Ted and Ed scouted around in 1924 and found the Cortland area to be a great spot, and they found this particular building in Cortland available, and so they decided to open the plant there. And then Tom and Ed, along with Sister Johanna, then came to Cortland and started up the boat company there. It's an early picture, again, I don't know the date, but you can see one of the reasons this was a great location was that it was on the railroad lines, and of course, Cortland had a good workforce as well to draw from. You can see the original three-story building here. Here's a line drawing. I can't really match up this line drawing with any of these pictures back here, but it's kind of the 1920s, 1930s style, and I thought it was kind of a cool drawing. Rendering is maybe not quite accurate. So 1946, my dad, who had worked at Oak Ridge on the Manhattan Project during the war, was decided by the family that he would take over the Cortland and run the Cortland plant. And so that's when they moved to Cortland. He had started working summers at the factory in Peshtigo when he was 14. Started out varnishing paddles, but ended up working in all of the departments in the factory at one time or another. And he was kind of the only one of his generation that ended up doing that. So he had intimate knowledge of what was going on in all the areas. When he started at Cortland, and here's kind of the workstation at Cortland. When he started there, they were building a boat in one place, and each person who worked there would build their boat, and they were to various places, around. But he turned it into a production line and increased the efficiency greatly, and also the output of the factory. When he started, there were only 16 workers after the war because they didn't have any war contracts there. The Peshtigo factory did have some war contracts, so they went through the World War II in production. It was a great success, and they ended up with about 250 employees. A couple things about this picture. You can see, of course, piles of sawdust around, lots of sawdust. And this right here is about a 4-foot saw blade that was about to take over on this piece of, on this log here. No guards, nothing on the saw blade, just whizzing out there in the air. But of course, because of all the sawdust throughout the building, there was always the danger of fire, and fires there were, both in Peshtigo and in Cortland. The major fires in Cortland were 1932, 1942, and 1950. The 1942 was by far the most devastating because the whole 3-story building burned down. So they had to start from scratch after that. This is the way the buildings ended up after the fire. One remnant of a 2-story building here, but then the rest of it ended up being a 1-story production line building on the same property that the original was on. And that was 1942. That was before my dad got there. But I remember you could hear the fire horn all over town, and we lived on the west side of town, and the factory was on the east side of town. I remember everybody in the house would quiet down when you heard the first blast of the fire horn, and so that you could listen to the code that the fire horn was blasting out. And the code tells you what part of town that the fire was in. So my dad would either sigh with relief or jump in the car and run downtown when he heard that code.
You know what they did during the war?
In Cortland, they didn't have any production really at all. There were only a handful of workers in Cortland. In Peshtigo, they produced some landing craft, I believe. I don't know the details of it, but I know one of the things they produced were some landing crafts. So this is an overhead view of the Cortland plant after the fire, and you can see there's all these 1-story buildings. the boats would move through the building in this direction and get painted down here. And then they had large warehouse spaces because the sales, of course, were seasonal. And so to be able to keep the workers busy all year round, you had to have some way of storing all of these boats. So these were the storage facilities. This building right here was the prototype building, so that's where interesting stuff was going on with design work. And I'll show you one of the results of that here in a little bit. Undated photo again, not sure when it was, but factory workers in the shop. And just a quick photo of some of those factory workers years later. My uncle had a couple of get-togethers of the old factory workers once the factory shut down over a couple summers, and these are, in particular, I remember Howard Henry had worked there for many, many years. Yes.
I had the privilege of attending those.
Oh, did
Yeah.
you?
I did.
Yes, right, yeah,
It was wonderful.
right, yeah. It was
Really
great get-together. The workers had wonderful memories.
Well, and there were some boats there, you know, people brought boats, and some of those workers said, you know, I built that boat.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, I'll get to it. I was gonna show you one of the boats that Ed, you probably saw, but, so, here we are. 1950s came along, and that was probably the height of the production for wooden boats in the US, in particular for Thompson. And one of the reasons that production changed was that after World War II, you could get this marine plywood and cut it into nice long strips, lap strake strips, and then bolt those lap strakes together to create a nice strong boat with some ribs to hold it into shape, but a lot of the strength came from the bolted plywood strips. And you know, there were lap strakes before the war made without plywood, but the plywood made it much easier to work with and much easier to build. And so here's some of the lap strake boats in production. One of the things that Thomson was proud of and thought was important was the lap strakes on Thompsons were actually bolted together rather than screwed or clinch nailed together. And so there would be a brass bolt every few inches down the hull at every rib, holding the laps together and holding the laps to the rib. And my uncle Ted, so my father's brother, much younger brother, tells of his first job at the factory was crawling on the underside of the boat with a bag of brass nuts in his hand. And his job was to pick up one nut at a time and put it on the end of the bolt that the other worker was poking through the hole, and hold it there while that worker spun the bolt on the other end and tightened it up against the rib. And then after all those bolts were, he said his fingers got really sore. And then after all those got put in place, both of the workers would go under and with a set of nippers and a grinder, and you'd nip off the end of the bolt right at the nut, and then grind it smooth so that it wasn't catching on anything. But those bolts made the hulls really strong. And here's some lap strakes that were just getting painted here. And here's a lap strake in the water with my dad and probably my older brother here on Skaneateles Lake. Just throw this in here, the Thomson had several branches that went off. There was not only Thomson Peshtigo and Thomson Cortland, but there was a company called Cruisers that was started by a group of Thompsons. And here's another Thompson skis produced in Crivets, Wisconsin. I don't know much about the production of those, but there they are, Thompson skis, by another branch of the family. So again, 1950s, motors were getting bigger, but most people didn't afford the big motors, so it made it a challenge to get up on the water skis with the smaller motors, and sometimes you didn't make it. So here's a typical scene out of our out of the window. Does this look something like the boats you were talking about? Yeah, only yours was green, you say. Yeah, okay. So these were canvas covered, cedar planked, called car top boats because they ended up late enough to be able to put on car top, 12 feet. And as you can see, the standard, at least at our end of the lake, the standard propulsion was an Evinrude 3. Yeah.
The boat on the left, which model is that, do you know?
This one?
Yeah.
I don't know exactly, I just know it was called car top.
Is it a Zephyr?
I don't know.
I have one upstairs that you can look at.
Oh, okay, yeah. Maybe Ed? Yeah.
Bruce, I don't know. I
Okay.
think the 14 it's a 14 footer.
Oh,
We have a 16 and 42 too.
So you,
We have a 16 foot and 42.
up at 42 we do, yeah, but your boat is a 14.
Mine's a
so
14.
I don't know if that's a little too heavy for your car topper, I just don't know.
Yeah,
I think
maybe.
so. Yeah,
I don't know, we've got all the catalogs,
yeah, my uncle mostly.
yeah.
Interesting here, though, with these 3 horsepowers, a couple things. One is, I noticed when I was looking over the picture, there's a piece of rope going from here over to here with a handle on it there. And if you look over on this one has the same piece of rope that goes all the way around. And so, it looks to me like we were rigging it up so you could sit in the middle seat and steer the 3 horsepower and maybe get it up on a plane. If you were light enough, if you were 50 pounds, yeah, you might get it up on the plane.
That was a little wishful thinking.
So, here's my brother and one of our neighbors and me. My brother thought it looked much better to take the side cowlings off the 3 horsepower, so he thought it made it look like it was going faster that way. And
There you are, Di, that's you, Di.
there I am, yeah. And so one of the advantages of growing up as the son of a boat builder is to get your own boat pretty early in life. Really, one reason I'm showing this is congratulations on the launch of the Pat 2. I was really excited to see that you guys had worked so hard and gotten that in the water with electric propulsion. And you probably know, but it was on Skaneateles Lake as the mail boat from 1956 to 81, I think?
91.
91? Okay. So, I think I was probably a little older than 6 at this time, but it would be a daily event for the mailboat to come by our end of the lake. So they'd start up at Skaneateles and we were down on the south end. And they'd come down to our end and then make a big turn and go up the other one after hitting a couple of cottages with mail. But I would keep an eye out, and when it was coming down the lake, I'd get out there with my 3 horsepower, and he had the biggest wake on the lake. So I would get up behind the Pat 2 with the 3 horsepower and surf down the wake and be able to get the thing onto the plane with 3 horsepower.
That's a great story.
My grandfather had a motor just like that.
And here's Bill Oben with my dad with the boat that Bill restored there.
Bob was the speaker at our luncheon, that boat show.
Right.
This was in the days when the museum
There we go.
would do an annual boat show weekend somewhere, and that was in Penn Yan,
Oh,
and Bob joined us and did our luncheon speech. It was memorable.
Yep. So there's a recording of that, and I'm hoping that maybe that'll get up on the web sometime. I've passed it on.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So Again, just throw this in, another kind of style of lapstrake was having lapstrakes on the bottom of the boat, but then straight mahogany ply on the side, because it was found you didn't need the laps on the upper half of the boat. You could stiffen it up underneath. So here's one that was like that.
And the steering wheel,
And, yeah,
very cool.
and notice this boat is, I'll talk about this in a minute, but it's built the same way with the mahogany plywood above, but lap straight marine plywood on the bottom.
Is that a Thompson sailboat?
Yes, I'll talk about that here in a second.
You will talk about it?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
The reason I'm showing this is mostly because of this, and that is, the race was on. It doesn't have anything to do with Thompson boats, but I'm pretty sure this is my brother in his pram with a Hurricane 10, Mercury Hurricane 10. I noticed you have one out here with a short shaft, and racing against a fellow from across the lake with his Century inboard. And I think the Century inboard won, but for 10 horsepower to keep up with a V8, that's pretty good.
I'd say.
So Thompson produced sailboats. At one time, in the 1940s, they were the largest builder of one-design sailboats in the country. Comets, Snipes, Lightnings, Olympics, and X-boats. And here's an example of the drawing of an X-boat. I didn't find a picture of the boat itself, but X-boats are particularly
Thousands of them.
right. Particularly important in our family because that's what Katie grew up on, sailing in Minnesota. They were the first boats that the kids would get into to learn how to sail and have a good time on those inland lakes. And so I'm sure a lot of their sails went from Peshigo, at least went that way. So here is,
Bruce?
yes,
Back to the sailboats.
yeah.
I'm remiss, I'm not sure what I've got. I think I have a Thompson Comet.
I think we might have seen that at that 2005 show.
Yeah, I think so. But I don't have any other Thompson sailboats, and I don't know of any.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So do you know of any out there?
He'll tell you here.
well, we know of 3 of these.
Really?
They're all still in use. Well, I'll
He'll
get
tell
to
you.
it. These were not, they were a prototype boat, and if you remember back there where I pointed out the prototype shop, I remember in 1956, 57, when a fellow named Fred Scott worked with my dad to design a sailboat, and they put together the prototypes in that prototype shop. I remember walking in there and seeing
Right.
this. This is number 1 off the production line. A production line that was pretty short because it ended up with number 12 and only 12 were ever produced. But this is the launch of number 1 at the north end of Skaneateles Lake. Looks like my mom taking care of the dousing for the boat.
Oh, the champagne?
It doesn't look like champagne in her hand, but
Oh.
it's got pouring water on it. And
Well, if you have opportunity to tell the current owners that there's a future for their boat,
Okay.
please do.
I'll get back to you on that in just a second.
Okay,
So
cool.
here's number 1 at our dock. Actually, number 1 ended up going to Lowell Thomas in Long Island. So Lowell Thomas was a commentator during World War II,
Right.
yeah, well known. He came to Cortland to help dedicate the new ski area, Greek Peak, opening up. And while he was there, my dad showed him around the factory and showed him this boat. He said, "Oh, can I have one of those?" My dad said, "Sure." So number 1 ended up down with him. However, number 5 ended up with us, and this is the way it looks today. We're still sailing it. It's still in, again, Justin helped us out with that one.
This is estate planning, okay?
Well, 8 of them ended up on the south end, 8 of the 12 ended up on the south end of Skaneateles Lake.
No kidding.
And that became the foundation for the South Skaneateles Singing and Sailing Society.
And sipping. Sipping.
and sipping.
Exactly.
After the race.
So
Wonderful.
here are four of them in this one picture, with a lightning right in the middle of all of this. And, because there were only 12 made and they were all sold, people who wanted to start sailing with the 5 S's had to find some other things to sail with us. So lightnings and flying Scots started showing up. We didn't know what to do with them because they were so much faster than our boats anyway.
Handicap.
Yeah. So here's Katie and my mom having fun
Yeah,
in that
that's
boat.
it. Oh, wow.
And my mom's skipping.
Beautiful.
And in our family, the best skippers were the women, of course. And my mom always skipped our boat in the races, and Katie always skips when I'm sailing with her. Much steadier and much better on the tiller than my dad and me. We did end up swapping with one other family. We would swap the honors for the best sailors for the year with the other family. It kind of went back and forth between the two of us. Ed, we do actually have another one in the family, and that's number 6. Again, we handed off to Justin to fix up for us.
Don't tease me.
You're a daring man to tell him about it.
And number 6 is actually on Cayuga Lake with my nephew at his place.
Wonderful. That's great.
And there's one other one on Skaneateles Lake, and that belongs to Hinchcliffe, which is a family just about a mile up from us. And sometimes we get out together on the lake and have fun. So, another innovation came along in 1959 when Volvo brought over the inboard-outboard design, having produced this from, I don't know the whole story and I don't have it written down here, but an inventor in the US couldn't sell the idea to people in the US, so he took it over and sold it and convinced Volvo to make this happen. And Volvo came back in 1959 boat show and showed it off, and my dad expressed great interest in it. And so from then on, started producing the sea skiff design, which is a lap strake. You can't quite see it here, with a Volvo outdrive. And it ended up with a lot of, as you can see, it had lots of gear on top here, lots of safety rails and so forth on the front deck. My dad, I think it was at the time that Cortland was transitioning to being owned by Chris-Craft, and Chris-Craft had kind of a hand in putting all this extra stuff on it. And I'm not sure my dad really liked it, because he took it all off. And ended up with a nice, what he called cleaner design. So this is our 19-foot sea skiff with a 100 horsepower Volvo outdrive on it. Still doing well. We had a couple of adventures in this boat, one of which was the president of Volvo came over to the U.S. To visit, to see, this engine running in a boat. And so my dad took them out on a cruise on the lake in the boat, and about 3 miles up the lake, they ran out of gas, to his embarrassment. But they pulled into shore, and somebody had a little bit of gas right there on the dock that they poured into the tank and sent them on their way. So, some friendly neighbors.
Those were the days, right?
Yeah.
It's not the last time that
But it's
happened.
not, but it actually, our family has ended up at that dock 3 times getting gas over the years. My nephew and me also had to do that. So another adventure was that our friend Patty Coyle, who was a good family friend and part of the team that, along with my parents, had started Greek Peak, worked in the book industry, and she became friends with Roger Torrey Peterson, who is the
Birdman.
bird guides and so forth. And so he and a British compatriot, she convinced them to come on up to the cottage and go for a ride in the boat. And I remember them driving down the driveway and coming out of the parking lot and him saying, "Oh my, a cerulean warbler," and just kind of looking all over and binoculars around his neck, of course. So they got into the boat and went on up the lake, and down at the south end of the lake, there's all sorts of cliffs that come right down to the lake along the shore. And so he was having a great time looking at the shorebirds, at least the cliff birds. And the particular event that was relayed to me after they got back was that someone knocked over the bottle of gin into the bilge, and that was a big event for the day. To lose a whole bottle of gin was
I thought that was you
devastating.
spilled it. Weren't you in the boat?
I don't think I was in the boat.
You don't remember.
I'm not going to
I
remember.
think you
Pre-bilge.
That's a story you're sticking to.
Will not confirm or deny.
That's right, deny, deny.
Well, here's my dad with the boat. It did become worse for the wear, and we again handed it off to our friend Justin Armstrong, and he left the mahogany marine plywood was still in good shape. It was the ribs that rotted out. And he took the ribs out and put in a new keel and new ribs, but left the mahogany plywood as it was, and rebuilt the whole thing for us, and repainted it, of course. And as all of you know, something like this causes you to lose sleep. Many sleepless nights figuring out what's going on with the dual carburetors on this sucker. Actually, I've solved that problem by never buying ethanol gas and always buying now. At one point, you couldn't buy non-ethanol gas, but now that you can get that, that seems to have fixed the problem. So we took it up to the Skaneateles Boat Show as well, and here's my mom and me and Katie showing off our fun boat. You can get a lot of people in this boat. Well, here's Donna and Jim,
Yes.
Yeah.
right?
He's promised me that boat, but I haven't seen it yet.
Wait a minute.
He's got a cruisette.
Yeah,
Do you
It's a
have a
cruisette, it's a cruisette that he's talking about bringing, but
Yeah,
I
this
think the
is.
family's getting in the way.
This
What?
is the cruisette, yeah.
Is that the
that's
cruisette?
Yeah,
theirs.
it is.
Yeah, it is, sure it is.
No, they're gonna give it to us.
What?
Me.
Well, you got a museum?
No, I want one though.
Okay. Katie, I want that boat.
Yeah.
So here's a view from the inside, and so there's room up here for bunk, and if you were out on the ocean, you could use it as a toilet as well. And it had twin 50 Mercs on it.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're still out cruising with it or not.
I think they're still using it.
Yeah.
I know he brought it to one of Ted's
Yeah.
Yeah,
factory
That's her
reunions.
that was this one.
Yeah, he brought it up to that reunion, and I've got to pick that conversation up again.
Yeah.
So.
There aren't any others around.
Hmm?
There aren't any around. There aren't any others.
No, none that I know of.
No?
Yeah. So exploring other technologies toward the end of the 50s, of course, people were building metal boats and starting to produce fiberglass boats. And one of the directions that my dad in Cortland went to was had to do with U.S. rubber material called royalite. And so this stuff was called expanded royalite because it had a skim of rubber on both sides and a foam rubber core that was flexible on the inside, and it was somewhat stiff. You have one, right?
I don't think I do.
I thought you guys got one of the 14-foot royalite, Royalcraft boats.
Bruce, I'll have to look, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think we saw it up at the north end of the lake at one time. North end of Seneca when we had that. Anyway, it was an interesting material. You can see it's kind of molded and kind of roundy and so forth. And if you put enough wood on it, it would somewhat keep its shape. But it really was only good for canoes and rowboats. This or small putt-putts and so forth. By the time you got up to 14 feet, it was just kind of floppy and didn't hold its shape at all in the water. So that was kind of a flop. And as you can see, it only lasted a few years before production stopped.
They use it on trucks, truck hoods too.
Really?
I have a truck hood that had diamond T trucks back in the late 50s and early 60s thereabouts, right up to 1970.
Well, Old Town also makes a boat that is kind of a successor to it. It is a material similar to this Royalite, only it's thinner and stiffer. And they make a canoe out of it. I forgot what they call that.
It's almost impossible to repair.
Yeah. Well, what we found out was that when we took it to Justin, our friend Justin, was that fiberglass would stick to the stuff. And so he fixed the holes in the back where we pushed it out from shore on the shale, and with fiberglass covering on it. And that seems to work pretty well. It's worked pretty well so far anyway. And here's my daughter and her 2 kids having fun in our putt-putt. We put a 5 horsepower Honda on that one. And that's the Royalite canoe. You can run it into anything and it won't hurt it. It'll just bounce off. And once in a while there might be a little dent in it. You take a hairdryer and warm it up and push it back and you're all set. Here's me and my grandson. They did make a few sunfish-like things as well, but as I said, they only lasted a couple of years. So more propulsion technology. This,
Bruce, would you back up that slide?
sure.
These are the ice boats?
No, this is a sunfish-like boat.
Oh, I got it,
Yeah,
okay.
made out of Royalite.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So another propulsion technology here. This particular, this is just off the web because it's the only one I found a picture of this ski jet, they call it here. But of course it's pumping water out of the back just like jet skis do now. But this particular one you see is driven by a V8 here. And it led to an accident, an incident I regret to this day. I'm going to read this. The boat factory put a powered boat like this with a V8 and a lap strike hull. And I remember the V8 didn't even have the cover on it. It was just sitting in the middle of the boat. And then this thing was on the back, and the purpose of the V8 was to pump water out the back of the boat and make it go. And it would really go. I mean, this thing would go 40 probably with a V8. And of course, at 40, the water coming out of the back would go about 50 feet out of the back of the boat before settling back in the water. They brought it out to Skinny Atlas to do some test runs with it and left it for a couple of days. And they gave me permission to take it out on my own. As this unthinking teenager, I saw the water shooting 50 feet out of the back of the boat, so I decided to run along the shore and swing the steering wheel as fast as I could and see how far I could sweep the water out the back of the boat. And of course it swept over the dock I was in front of, and there on the dock were about 3 or 4 people lounging in lounge chairs, and I sprayed them completely with this shed of water out the back, and, unthinking.
And they said?
They are still friends to this day. I have apologized almost.
How many
every time
years
I
did
see
it
them
take?
for doing that to them. So things were winding down. In 1962, Chris Craft Corporation bought out Thompson Boats. They still were running the wooden boat line in Cortland, but at the same time, they built a plant outside of Cortland to work on fiberglass boats. In particular, the Corsair first and then the Lancer after that. And here's a picture of the Lancer, produced from 69 to 77. Nice fast runabouts. They were extremely well built, very solid, and pretty heavy. Here's the production line in the Cortland plant. We did own a 17-foot with a V8 in it for a little while, and that would go at a pretty good clip. This particular one was, where production moved to Chattanooga in 1975, so, and this one was actually produced in Chattanooga.
Yeah, those were the years where Chris Craft had numerous plants. didn't they?
Yeah, and they kept moving things around, and then they started closing things.
Michigan,
Right.
they were in
That-
Michigan.
Those were the days. My dad at that time was the president of the small boat division, so he was kind of in charge of trying to make all those pieces work. At the same time, the Chris Craft Corporation was buying newspapers and radio stations and all manner of things, so it got kind of complicated.
I did not know that.
So the last boat I want to show you is actually this boat that I worked on for 10 years. And it's actually a flying boat. So we're just finished the test phase of flying that last year, and we're going to fly it some this year. So that's the latest Thompson boat in the line.
Looks like a petrol.
How many passengers does that carry?
Two.
Two.
So, the last wooden boats came off the line in Cortland in 1968. And my dad has kind of this note in the end of his memoir, of which I think there's one in the library here. Thompson was a leading builder during the wooden boat years, putting out thousands of boats a year from the two factories. Their aim was to make a safe, reasonably priced boat for the working man, the Ford of the boat industry as opposed to the Cadillac of Chris Craft. They were the innovators of several design and production procedures, including the compressed seam construction, spray rails, and V-bottom runabouts. They had the largest warehouse and storage facilities of any boat builder. So Thompson boats are still prized possessions of many proud owners. So, thank you for listening. Thanks for coming.
Bruce, do you